I know many of you know Medea, and we are very glad to be able to provide this couple of hours attention to her latest work, not only the book about drones, but the fact that she's taken this work both to Pakistan and Yemen and has come into a situation very consciously to go find out what the victims of the U.S. drone war think. So we're going to hear from you right now, Medea.
It feels a little strange giving a talk about drones to people like The World Can't Wait, who know more about drones probably than I do, and then to be here in this room with people who've been doing such incredible work on these issues. I just want to take a moment to recognize the work of Debra and The World Can't Wait, and to recognize the work of Matt and Witness Against Torture, the work of Veterans for Peace, and the Granny's Peace Brigade. Yes. So can we just give a collective clap for these amazing groups?
Take a look. Remember, you got a mic there, okay?
So I think collectively we are, if I'm not wrong, Debra, are we kind of the essence of the groups that started protesting around drones a couple of years ago?
I think so.
Are we leaving out any? So none of our groups is very big, I think I can say, right? In fact, we're all pretty small groups. But we have done amazing work in these years to take a policy that was just covered in secrecy, so much so that the US government kept saying, drones? What drones? We don't have drones, to a totally different position where we are today. And if there's anything to take away from tonight, it's that a small group of people indeed can make a huge difference. And on an issue that would seem so intractable because it's part of the military, industrial, congressional, and let's throw in presidential complex there. And these folks just love their wars, and they keep their wars going, and they find new ways to wage their wars. And here, a small number of people, very few groups, have been standing outside of bases and outside of government offices and doing whatever we could think of for years to expose a covert program. And it's pretty amazing to think how far we've come. So I'll go back and give you some of the depressing things first, but I do want to focus on the accomplishments, because I think it's quite extraordinary. So first, just a reminder, or for those who haven't paid too much attention to this, drones are indeed the new way of waging war in the 21st century. This started under the Bush administration, but the Bush administration was still involved in things like picking people up and throwing them into black sites, or extraordinary rendition, or in places like Guantanamo, and the old-fashioned way of war by invading other countries with our troops. So the drones have really come into their own under the Obama administration. When we talk about drones, there's all kinds of drones, and as we are here talking about them, there's probably some people out there who are developing new kinds of drones, because there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and they just mean that it's something that flies in the air, that has a little camera on it, that relays that remotely, and is mostly used for surveillance purposes. There are potentially lots of good uses for drones. We certainly know that in some places they're being used to try to track forest fires or endangered species, or stop illegal whaling or illegal logging in Brazil. But most of this industry is driven by your tax dollars and is driven by the military. And while a lot of the drones are for surveillance purposes, we're going to talk tonight mostly about the drones that are for killing purposes. And for those of you who've never seen what the inside of a remotely controlled room where the pilots are, it looks like this. And they are intentionally modeled after a video game. And the The joystick is something that the pilot would press to kill people. And this is something the UN has denounced, saying the US is developing a PlayStation mentality towards war. But just think of how surreal it is that somebody is sitting in upstate New York, like at Hancock Base, or outside of Las Vegas, or in Whiteman Base in Missouri, and they are looking at a screen that's giving them information about a place that's 8,000 miles away. They never have to go near the country where they'll be killing people. And they get to go home at the end of the day and be supposedly well integrated into the lives of their families and their communities. It's a lot that we're asking of mostly young people, and perhaps it's a good thing that we find that there's a lot of PTSD among these drone pilots, because it means they have a conscience. They see what they're doing during the day, and it's hard for them to forget it when they go home at night. And the question becomes, who are we killing? And I just came off of a 2-week speaking tour in upstate New York with my partner Tig. Where is Tig? It's probably off doing something. It was really interesting, because while we spoke a lot to friendly audiences, we did speak to people in public libraries where just ordinary folks came in who didn't know a lot about drones. And inevitably, there would be somebody who would say, but this is the only option we have for killing these Al-Qaeda people who want to attack us, and the drones are so precise, and it's much better than having our troops in the ground. And they've bought hook, line, and sinker this notion that the administration has put out there. And I tell them, well, first of all, we don't know how many people have been killed by drones, but let's take Senator Lindsey Graham's figure that he threw out there one day, because he's on committees that we don't have access to, and he said 4,700, and he wasn't counting Afghanistan. So if it was 4,700 people killed by drones, how come we only know that there are 50 people who were on the kill list of high-level Al-Qaeda targets, people who are out to do us harm? So do the math. Who are these other thousands of people? The administration will say that they were militants. We have to ask, well, who is a militant? And isn't this program only supposed to kill high-value target people who are out to kill Americans? Well, where have we used these? Extensively in Iraq, continue to use them in Afghanistan. In fact, if you look at this graph, this is something that was up on the military's own website until some of us started talking about it, and then they scrubbed the numbers. It's no longer available from their website. But it showed that while they were increasing the number of drone strikes over the years, it's a huge jump when you got to 2012. And it gives you the impression, while the US is supposed to be winding down the war in Afghanistan, the drones are probably not going to leave Afghanistan. Where else have we used them? Well, we use them in the case of Libya, which is particularly disturbing, because when the Obama administration decided they were going to give air cover to Gaddafi, did the Obama administration said, oh, we must go to Congress because this is something that Congress, by the Constitution, is supposed to decide? No. No, it did not go to Congress, even though a number of Congress people said, hey, we're supposed to discuss this. Give us a chance to talk. Of course, knowing our Congress, they would have said, go right in. But in any case, they're supposed to, by constitutional law, be the ones that decide whether we get involved militarily. But the Obama administration said, no, this is not war because we're only using drones and no American lives are at risk. So imagine that example that is now set for the next president, and the next president, and the next president. Other places, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, potentially Mali, and look at the places that we are building up the drone bases. That's all over the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, which should be a red flag, which we should say that in itself is a danger to us, because one of the reasons Osama bin Laden said he hated the United States was because we had drone bases in Saudi Arabia, in the Holy Lands. And Bush, in all his wisdom, might I say, one of the positive things Bush did was to close the bases in Saudi Arabia, and then we have Obama coming in and opening a base in Saudi Arabia. And then there was a piece in the Washington Post last week that talked about how the U.S. wants to expand its drone presence, and particularly the surveillance part of the drones, to other places in Asia and the Pacific, as well as places in South America and Central America. So we see this tremendous expansion, and one of the places where we can really look at what have been the results of that is in Pakistan, where there have been over 350 drone strikes, most of them, as I said, during the Obama administration. And we had a chance to take a delegation to Pakistan to talk to the drone victims. And that was something that was very profound, because it was the first time that these drone victims ever had a chance to tell their stories to a group of Americans. And this is the group that got together to meet up in Islamabad, in the capital. We had a chance to talk to this photographer, Noor Baram, who risks his life going out to take pictures of the drone victims. And he says most of the time when he gets there, there are no bodies left. There's just pieces of flesh lying around, sometimes hanging off of trees. Can't tell if the flesh was from an animal, from a human being, can't tell who the person was. And in addition to the suffering of people who lost their loved ones is the fact that they can't give them a decent religious burial because they can't even find the body parts. And so the pictures that he showed us were pictures of people who were not the intended targets but were killed by the shrapnel. And these are some of the pictures of the almost 200 Pakistani children who have been killed. And you might remember that John Brennan, who is now the head of the CIA, told us in 2011 that there were no civilians that had been killed, and now says there are just a handful. And even Dianne Feinstein, the senator who's in charge of the Intelligence Committee, said, oh, just a handful of civilians who have been killed. Well, it's definitely a lie that she's been saying, and we had a chance to hear firsthand from people like this man, Karim Khan, who was living in the capital in Islamabad when he got a call from his family that his home had just been destroyed by a drone, and that his son and his brother had both been killed in this drone strike. And they were teachers in the local village who wanted to go back and teach in that village because there were Taliban around, and they wanted to teach the young people that education was much more powerful than a gun. And so he said to us, you can imagine the lesson that these hundreds of students learned when their beloved teachers were killed by a US drone strike, which left them, he said, aching for revenge. And that's something we heard over and over, this issue of aching for revenge. We heard it when people talked to us about the drone strike on March 17th in 2011, when a community was meeting together in a traditional setting called a jirga to deal with local problems. And to somebody thousands of miles away in a control room, it looked like a bunch of no-good Taliban, let's send in the drones, which they did, and sent in one round, another round, another round, until they killed 42 of the most respected leaders in that community. And imagine the hatred and the aching for revenge that comes from that kind of a drone attack. Well, some of you might have had a chance to listen to President Obama when he gave his foreign policy speech in May at the National Defense University, and I had a chance to be in the audience when he gave that speech. And, you know, I wasn't sure I was going to get up and say anything. I wanted to listen very closely to what he had to say. And I really thought, perhaps naively, because I'd been reading some press accounts, that there was going to be a major policy change, and he was going to announce it during that speech, in which case I was going to sit there quietly and be happy that there had been some major policy change. But I listened and I listened and I listened, and what I heard was a justification for the drone program. And what I heard was a big lie that he has been telling, which is that his administration's policy is to capture people and that killing is a last resort. And that just isn't true. And having had a chance to meet with people who were family of this young man, Tariq Aziz is just one of the many examples we heard where it would have been so easy to capture someone. So this teenager hated the drones because his cousin had been killed by a drone strike, his village had been terrorized by the drones, and he had a chance to go into the capital city, meet with other drone strike family members, meet with people from the legal community who wanted to see how they could use the courts, and decide that they needed more citizen journalists who would go back to their villages and document what was happening. He was really excited about doing that, except the first case to be documented was his own death that happened 2 days later. But he could have been picked up any time if there was reason to believe that this 16-year-old was a high-level Al-Qaeda or Taliban member who was out to do harm to Americans. He could have been picked up, but the U.S. thought it was just easier, cleaner to kill him. And this is something we heard over and over and over again. And so when I heard President Obama say that during his speech, I felt obligated to get up and say something. And the other issue that's so important to understand when we talk about these drone strikes, and this came out in the study that was done by the University of Stanford and NYU, and I incorporated it into the new version of my book because it's so important to not just think about the numbers of people killed, the numbers of people maimed, the people who lost their homes, but also to think of what this does to the fabric of the community and how this is an act of terrorism and collective punishment against entire swaths of people. And it talked about how the drones terrorize the children who are afraid to go to bed at night, who wet their beds, who are afraid to go to school because schools have been attacked, women who are afraid to go to the marketplace because markets have been attacked, people who are afraid to go to any community kind of gathering like the jirgas that I mentioned, or weddings or funerals, because all of them have been attacked. And so how it really eats at the community and makes everybody feel like the drone is out to get them. They say it's like having a bee buzzing in your head because you hear the buzzing and you see the drone overhead and you never know when it's going to hit and who it's going to hit, but you think it's going to hit you. And imagine living with that kind of terror day in and day out. Well, the Pakistani people have been protesting the drones and saying that this is a major violation of their sovereignty. They voted against the drone attacks in the legislature where it was unanimous. This is probably the only thing that all the parties in Pakistan can agree on. The president, who is newly elected, said in the first speech he gave after the elections that the country was against drone attacks. The courts, it went up to the high courts in Peshawar where they said this is a violation of the nation's sovereignty. And then the people on the local level in the tribal areas have been protesting. So we got a chance to join in one of the protests in the Capitol when we were there. We got a chance to do a day of fasting in memory of the innocent people who were killed. We had a chance to speak to lots of media and be on the TV and be in the front pages of the newspaper when we were there. And we had a chance to go to the tribal areas to speak to people who were the direct victims of this terror and to tell them that we as Americans were so ashamed of our government's policies that we wanted to apologize on behalf of people of conscience in the United States who believed that their lives were indeed as important as our lives and their children were as important as our children. And we were so scared when we were going up on the stage because we had been told by our ambassador, don't go up there. It's the people are going to try to kill you. The Taliban know you're coming. And so there we went with our hearts beating onto the stage to address this crowd and heard them yelling out, welcome, welcome, welcome. We want peace. We want peace. And found that when you give a little love out there, you get a lot of love back. And unfortunately, what our government has been giving is a lot of hate, a lot of Hellfire missiles and Predator drones and Reaper drones. And what we've been reaping in that part of the world is a lot of hate. But we thought this is the kind of citizen diplomacy that is so important, actually, not only to get the word out to people in these countries that there are Americans who care about them, but also for our own safety as Americans. And so we decided that that was an important thing to do in Yemen as well. And Yemen is a country where the drone strikes have increased, especially since 2009, when the Obama administration started using them more. And in case you don't know where Yemen is, it's in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. It's a very, very poor country, just like Afghanistan, just like Pakistan. And we took a small delegation this time because we were told that there was a spate of kidnappings of Westerners going on, and that it would not be a good thing for us to be a large group of Americans traveling together. So we took a 7-person delegation, found a very beautiful traditional society, beautiful culture, amazingly beautiful old city of Sana'a that is now a World Heritage Site of UNESCO. We found a very traditional society where women, for the most part, are covered, and men, especially around the capital area, have a very, I think, elegant traditional garb. And here is Tig, who I mentioned, who is outside, but you might not recognize him here in this photo. When he was dressed up in that beautiful traditional dress, except he was missing, you might see the dagger around his waist, which he didn't quite want to use. But people were warm and welcoming to us, and this woman was especially welcoming because she is the Minister for Human Rights. And she came to the United States trying to push the U.S. to release the Guantanamo prisoners who are from Yemen. You know, the majority of prisoners in Guantanamo are from Yemen, and got very upset when she couldn't get any high-level meetings in the White House or the State Department, and issued us an invitation to come to meet with the family members of Guantanamo victims. We met with dozens of those family members. We heard just terrible stories, like one of the women you see here, her son was picked up when he was 17 years old, and she didn't hear from him for an entire year, had no idea where he was. The young woman that you see over in the left-hand corner there, she's 12 years old. She was in her mother's womb when her father, whose picture she is holding, was captured, and she has never, ever had a chance to meet her father in person. And the only contact she's had with her father in all these years is the last year when, thanks to the Red Cross, they have had a chance every 2 months to have a video conference with their family members. And she said, as she stood up to talk about her father, she said that the last time they tried to talk to him, he was one of the people on the hunger strike, and he was so debilitated from the hunger strike that he could barely lift his head and he couldn't speak to them. So imagine this young girl seeing her father across this teleconference and not being able to reach out to hold him. And she started crying as she was telling us the story. And her uncle, who you see over there in the keffiyeh, said, perhaps that is the most important message she could send back to the United States, is her tears. And her mother named her Auda, which means come home. And she certainly would like to see her father come home, as all these family members want to see their loved ones come home. We also had a chance while we were there to meet with drone strike families. And this is a man from one of the tribal areas whose brother had been a teacher by day and also on the side was a taxi driver. One day he picked up a group of strangers in the taxi, and the next minute, you know, the entire taxi was blown up. And he came with a certificate from the Yemeni government showing that his brother had nothing to do with any extremist activities, was indeed a teacher in the schools. He brought along the children of his brother, who would never get a chance to be with their father again. He talked about his brother's wife, who is now widowed, and when we asked how she was doing, he said that every day she wakes up and sobs, and that's all she can do is sob and sob and sob. And she said, do people in the United States realize the kind of agony that this policy is creating? The young people who will never see their parents again, the wives who will never see their husbands again. He showed us a piece of the Hellfire missile that he carries around to show that it was indeed the United States that killed his brother. And he said to us that in his tribal culture, if you do something wrong, whether it's by accident or on purpose, that you have to do something to seek redress, to atone for what you have done. And he said, in our tribal culture, we have to first acknowledge the wrongdoing, apologize for the wrongdoing, compensate for the wrongdoing. And he said, we can't get the U.S. to do any of that. And he asked us, could it be that our tribal culture is more evolved when it comes to justice than the United States government? And we had to tell him yes. But he said that they are waiting for the U.S. to do something. And they are waiting for us, the American people, to force our government to do something, to acknowledge the wrongdoing. And in his culture, these young boys are supposed to seek revenge for the death of their loved ones. And if the U.S. does not do anything to acknowledge, apologize, compensate, we are not only creating enemies for this generation, we are creating enemies for the next generation as well. And some of you might have heard this young man, Farah al-Muslimi, when he came to testify in Congress here in the United States. And we got a chance to talk to him when we were in Yemen. The story that he told here in the United States was quite extraordinary because he was one of the few Yemenis from a very, very poor family who was lucky enough to get a scholarship to come and spend a year in high school in the United States in Middle America. And he lived with a family that became like his parents. He loved the United States. He went back home praising the United States. And because his English was now so good, he became a journalist. And lo and behold, as a journalist, he started learning about and researching these drone strikes and became more and more upset about what he learned. And he was asked to come to the U.S. to testify in Congress. And what happened was pretty amazing in that 6 days before he was supposed to come to the U.S., a drone strike hit his own village. And he said never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that there would be a drone strike in his village. He said it's such a tiny village that you can't even find it on Google Maps. It's such a tiny village that everybody knows everybody else. If there were reason to believe that there was a high-level Al-Qaeda person there who was out to do harm to Americans, people would have captured this person and brought him into the court system. But nobody ever tried to ask the tribal leaders for help. Nobody ever charged anybody in the village with a crime. Instead, there was just a drone strike that killed 6 people. And so he said that it is now, he is in danger going back to his own village. He's afraid to go to his village because he said what that drone strike did in an instant is what the extremists have never been able to do, which is turn the entire village against the United States. So he was afraid to go back to his village. He was actually afraid to be in Yemen because he was known as somebody who had lots of friends in the United States. So far I've been telling you about people who said that their loved ones were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or it was an accident, or it was a tragic mistake. But this example that I wanted to give is a family that we got a chance to talk to in the capital city. And while we were talking to this young woman and her mother, they told us that her 3 brothers had actually joined Al-Qaeda. And we wanted to know how that happened, how these young teenagers ended up joining Al-Qaeda. And she said, well, one of them got in trouble, ended up in prison, was terribly abused while in prison, and when he was in prison, he met Al-Qaeda members. And the Al-Qaeda members said, join us and we will help you get retribution against the government. And so when he got out, he went and joined Al-Qaeda. And he convinced his other brothers to join Al-Qaeda. And as he was telling us the story, Tig, who has 2 teenage boys and lives in LA, said, wow, this sounds just like teenagers in Los Angeles who join the Bloods or the Crips or get involved in some kind of gang. And they said, yeah, that's kind of like it happened. This young girl said, I tried to convince my brothers to get out of Al-Qaeda, not to hang around with these guys. But while we were trying to get them to turn themselves in and get some rehabilitation, the U.S., who had nothing to do with this because those young boys had no beef with the United States, the U.S. comes in and kills them with a drone. And so imagine what we are doing, even when we say, okay, there's innocent people who get killed, there's young children that get killed, but the rest are, quote, militants. Even if they are militants that somehow got caught up with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, do we have the right to go in and kill these young people? And aren't there other ways that young people should get a chance to reorient their lives, to get a chance to have some rehabilitation, get a chance to have some training so that they can get some jobs and have hope for the future? And that's what this young girl said to us. And what was really so heartfelt is after this discussion where they said to us, you know, we had no problem with the United States. In fact, she's learning English. She wants to be an English teacher. And at the end of telling us this tragic story about her 3 brothers, she asked the men in our group to leave the room. And the mother and myself were there with the young girl and one of the other women that was on the trip with us, who some of you might know, Terry Rockefeller, who's with September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, lost her sister in the 9/11 attacks. The young girl said, we wanted you to stay behind because we want you to see our faces. And the mother and the girl pulled up their veils and showed their faces and started sobbing and holding us and kissing us and saying, we love you, we love you. We love that you came here because you wanted to hear about our story. We love that you came here because you cared about the lives of my brother. You cared about our sons. And please go back and tell people in the United States that even if young people join a group that's affiliated with Al-Qaeda, it doesn't mean that the right thing to do is for the Americans to come in and kill them. So we heard that story, and then we heard the story directly from Nasser al-Awlaki, who some of you might have heard of because he is the father of Anwar al-Awlaki, the grandfather of Abdurrahman al-Awlaki, the 2 Americans killed by drone strikes. And this man, if you hear him talk, and you might have, anybody here see Dirty Wars? So some of you have, you've heard him there, and if you've read Jeremy's book, or if you got the New York Times about 2 weeks ago and saw the incredible op-ed that he wrote. This man is so gentle, so articulate, so loves the United States as well, because he came and got his education in the United States and went home and really has used his education. He was Minister of Agriculture. He is doing such good work in a country that might be the first, Sana'a might be the first city in the world to run out of water. So there are tremendous agricultural problems in Yemen that he is working on. And his son, Anwar al-Awlaki, got more and more radicalized as the U.S. invaded Iraq, as he saw the U.S. killing more and more Muslims. He went back to Yemen, put on a kill list by President Obama, killed in a drone strike, and then 2 weeks later, his son, 16-year-old, killed in a drone strike. And Nasser al-Awlaki said to us that there were Americans, of course unnamed, after this drone strike, when he was killed with a bunch of his teenage cousins while they were having dinner, who said, oh, well, it was a bunch of militants. And then when he said, but wait, this was an American, they said, oh, but he was a 21-year-old American militant. They said that Nasser, the grandfather, had to produce the birth certificate to prove he was a 16-year-old. And he was an American citizen. And the grandfather said, he was the gentlest, sweetest boy you would ever want to meet. He was not involved in any kind of militant activities. And as he said in his op-ed piece, and as he is doing now in the court case, where the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU are trying to help him, he says, I just want an explanation of why the U.S. government killed my 16-year-old American grandson. And I think that he and we deserve that explanation. And when you look at this young boy, your heart has to go out to the family. And Debra started out talking to us about the Trayvon Martin case and the amazing response that we're now seeing around the country of people standing up and saying, we will not tolerate this. We don't want to live in a country where young men get killed for nothing. And that is the same thing that happened to Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki as an American, and it's the same thing that's happening to teenagers in places like Pakistan and Yemen. And I don't know if you got a chance to hear Cornel West when he was on Democracy Now! The other day, but boy, did he rip into President Obama. And he said that with the drone policy, that President Obama is a global George Zimmerman. I mean, that's a pretty amazing statement to make. So just let that sink in if you haven't heard that before. Because President Obama said that if he had a son, he could have looked like Trayvon Martin and expressed sympathy for the family. But if President Obama had a son, he could have looked like Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, and President Obama didn't express any kind of sympathy to the family. In fact, it's President Obama's policy that murdered this 16-year-old. So we had a chance while we were in Yemen to protest at the U.S. Embassy, and this is the first time ever that Americans have joined with Yemenis to protest both the drone strikes and to protest the continued indefinite detention of people in Guantanamo. And it was I think, a very important symbolic act to do. And I think it had an impact because the ambassador in Yemen, who we did get a chance to meet with, was then put on the spot because we said to him, why don't you meet with these families? Why don't you hear their stories? And he did promise us that he would meet with their families, except after we left, it turned out he was too scared to meet with them, even though there's 10,000 security checks you have to go through to get into the U.S. Embassy. He still didn't feel that he could face these people. And so the meeting that he promised he would have with them was by a video conference. Then in the same city of Sana'a, he refused to meet with these families. Well, it is just a shameful policy that the U.S. has, and it is a policy that is so dangerous because not only are we creating so many enemies around the world, giving justification for extremists. In fact, there was a young woman that we met in Yemen who was one of the few women that went around uncovered, and she was a journalist who said that politics and religion don't mix well, and that religious people should just get out of politics. Well, that was considered blasphemy, and there was a fatwa issued against her by Al-Qaeda. And this woman was in danger for her life. And I said, well, what did you do? And she said, well, I started covering myself so that I could go around and nobody would know who I was. And that was my protection for a while. until a year passed and she felt that she could be out by herself again. And I said, well, you must really hate Al-Qaeda. What do you think about the drone strikes? And she said, I think they are barbaric. And I said, well, how else do you deal with this? She said, rule of law. That's what the U.S. is supposed to stand for. And when you take some of these Al-Qaeda people, she said, who are thugs and criminals, and you kill them with a drone strike, you turn them into martyrs. And if you had captured them and convicted them of wrongdoing and let them rot in jail, they would have been mere criminals and people would have forgotten about them. And so what you are doing is elevating their status and elevating their cause. And she was one of the members of a dialogue group that is part of Yemen's transition from a dictatorship. They had their Arab Spring. They have a new president now who is kind of an interim president while they are going through this dialogue with 565 members from all walks of life in Yemen who are meeting for 6 months. And now it's about past the 3-month mark. And they are trying to set up the new Yemen. What's it going to look like? They're debating all kinds of policies. How do we deal with the water crisis? How do we deal with poverty? How do we deal with compensation for people who have been harmed by the dictatorship? And how do we deal with things like the drone strikes? Well, they, in their deliberations, passed a resolution. And to pass a resolution, you need at least 90% of the vote. They passed a resolution just recently that said drone strikes are illegal in Yemen, as is all kind of extrajudicial killing. Well, just think about this for a moment, because that dialogue is the hope for a democratic Yemen. That dialogue is something that we, the U.S. taxpayers, are helping to pay for. That dialogue is something that the U.S. government says that it supports. And so here you have the president of Yemen, who was put in place after the Arab Spring as an interim president. He wants to keep getting money from the U.S., so he says, yeah, you can do these drone strikes. And he's in Washington, D.C. right now, and he's going to meet with President Obama on Thursday. So he says, yes, I'm in favor of the drone strikes. And the democratic process, representing all sectors of society, all parties, including the president's own party, has overwhelmingly said, no, we do not want these drones. So who is Obama going to listen to? We don't know. We don't know, but we certainly know that some of us are going to be out in front of the White House and the Yemen embassy on Thursday saying, listen to the majority of the Yemeni people who are saying no to the drones. So the danger of this policy is also the danger of proliferation, just like the danger of nuclear weapons. And here, unlike nuclear weapons, this is an easier technology, and this is a technology that's already being sold to so many different countries that it's now over 75 countries that have some sort of drones. The US companies are selling them, but the Israelis are the #1 exporter of drones. They also brag about how they keep battle testing their drones against the Palestinians and, quote, improving the technology. And the Chinese, who know a good market when they see one, recognize this as multi-billion-dollar business, are producing dozens of different kinds of drones. And so you have tremendous proliferation going on right now. And certainly there are going to be some countries and some non-state entities and some individuals who are going to start using drones against us here at home. And there was a White House spokesperson that said, I would hate to be the spokesperson that had to get up and berate another country for using drones against somebody here in the United States. And who is driving all of this? is? Well, it is the drone industry, which represents every single major manufacturer of weapons in this country. It started out with a relatively small company, General Atomics, based in San Diego, but when the other companies saw that this was the wave of the future, they've all gotten on the bandwagon. Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, they are all producing drones or parts of drones. And the parts are being produced all over the country, because you know how these weapons manufacturers work. They are very smart. They want to make sure that there's parts of their weapons that are being produced in every single congressional district in this country, so that one, they can bribe our Congress people with, quote, donations to their campaigns, and two, they can get their Congress people to say, oh, we must continue making these weapons because jobs, jobs, jobs. And I mentioned that we just came back from upstate New York, and even in one of the supposed bastions of peace and love like Woodstock, there is a manufacturer there named Rotron that is producing the fans that go into the largest drone called the Global Hawk. So we stirred up a lot of people in Woodstock to try to stop this fan maker from making more contracts with drone manufacturers. And the other issue that is important to look at is the drones being used against us here at home by our own government. And that is the way that we are headed unless we do something about it. So the Federal Aviation Administration, thanks to the lobby group, they were forced to pass legislation that said the U.S. airspace must be open to drones by 2015, and in the meantime, we will experiment by giving out permits just to see what happens when you have these drones in the air, and how do you stop collision with commercial airplanes and all kinds of other disasters. And so permits have been given out to some of the manufacturers, the state universities, to the FBI, Homeland Security. The Border Patrol is already using drones, and about 3 dozen of the police departments. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the drone manufacturers really, really want to sell drones to the police departments. There's lots of them out there, 18,000 of them. You should have seen the propaganda they put out after the Boston bombing to say every single community needs a drone, especially when you're going to have some gathering. There has to be something up in the air that will show you everything that's going on. And as part of those experimenting in drones, it's part of this militarization of our police forces in this country that has been so disastrous. And you can see here in this picture this small county outside of Houston that already has its own militarized tanks, its own uniforms that look like they're in the middle of a war in Afghanistan, their weapons that look like they're at war. And that wasn't enough. They had to get a drone. But it's a poor county, so they didn't have money for it. What did they do? They went to Homeland Security. They got a $300,000 grant to buy a drone. But the only positive thing in this story is when they did the press conference to show off their cool drone, the person who is manipulating the drone got it up into the air, and they're all cheering, and then the drone crashes into the tank. So they do crash a lot. But there is, on the positive side, a lot of fight back about this. And you know, we don't often get to be fighting against something before it is proliferated in our communities, and that's a chance we have now with the drones here at home. And so as I travel around, I've been encouraging even very small communities to pass resolutions saying, we don't want law enforcement to have these drones, or if they can't get that through, unless there is a court order, unless there is probable cause. We want our privacy protected. We want our safety protected. Or we want a moratorium until we know how these drones are going to be used. And there are small cities that have been passing resolutions. There are, some of you might have heard of a really, really small town in Colorado called Deer Trail. Anybody heard of that? Well, they said they were going to start giving out hunting licenses for people to shoot down drones. In fact, they said they were going to have a bounty of $100 for anybody that comes with drone parts to show that they shot down a drone. The FAA did not like that at all and came back immediately and said, that is not safe to do. Somebody might get hurt when you shoot down a drone. And there are a number of states that have, 5 of them have already passed legislation saying that you need to have probable cause. And there are many other states that are debating this right now, and some of them have gotten all the way to pass it in both houses of the state, and now sitting in the governor's level, where the drone manufacturers are putting a lot of pressure on the governors to say, oh, this is a jobs issue, you must have drones, this is the wave of the future. So there are major fights that are happening on the local levels, and then on the level of how do we connect what might be happening to us here at home with drones that can turn us into even more of a surveillance society than we are today. And thanks to Edward Snowden for revealing what the NSA has been doing. The drones can take us even one step further, because if there are drones overhead, it will be 24/7 surveillance society. And your mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, who won't be mayor for too much longer, has said that the New York City Police needs drones. And we can talk about later maybe what some of you might be doing about that. And I started out talking about how the groups, these small groups like The World Can't Wait and like Veterans for Peace and the Grannies and Code Pink, have been out in front of the drone bases where the drones are being piloted, have been out in front doing weekly protests now at the CIA. Catholic workers have been incredible on this, going to the Pentagon, waves of arrest, Gandhian-style waves of arrests. There is now, thanks to Veterans for Peace, a weekly protest in San Diego outside the weapons manufacturer, General Atomics. And when you see the protests outside, like Creech Air Force Base, there have been Code Pink people going there for several years now. And we met one of the drone pilot, one of the analysts for the drones, who said to us that she gave up her job, but when she saw when she would be driving into work every day and see these 4 or 5 people standing out there with signs saying, when drones fly, children die, she said, I hate that group, Code Pink, and why are those people standing out there all the time? But she said it started to get to her, seeing it again and again and thinking about what it said on that banner, and then she decided she couldn't keep doing this work. And so sometimes we feel like there are just 4 or 5 of us that care about this issue, and what the hell are we doing standing out there week after week? But you realize that it's having an impact. And I think that this is one of the issues that I've worked on where we're having an impact at a faster rate than many of the other issues that are so hard to deal with around war and peace issues. And I say that because it was just in February of 2012 when they took that poll that said 83% of Americans think it's fine to kill terrorist suspects, people have never been convicted of anything with a drone, and that included even liberal Democrats. So you fast forward to today, and the polls show maybe 60%. And that's a huge drop in just about 1 year's time. And it means that the more that people learn about this, the more upset they are about it, which is a very positive thing. And the other way we can show a measure of success is that President Obama was forced to give a major policy address about this issue and was forced to try to justify his policy about drones. That's a huge victory for us. But a real measure of success is that we are forcing the government to change its policy. And that is, if you look at Pakistan and you look at Yemen, the number of drone strikes has gone down significantly last year and this year. And that is because of the work that many of you in this room have been doing. In fact, there was just a piece that came out in the papers yesterday that said it's because of the protest happening overseas and because of the criticism here at home that our government has been forced to, quote, be more careful about how they are using these drones. forced to stop using the signature strikes where they kill people just on the basis of suspicious behavior, and forced to start thinking about who is being killed when they are using these drones. So your work, standing out, protesting, your work criticizing the government, is actually saving lives in places like Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia. So when you ever get very disappointed and said, why do we keep doing this stuff, recognize that it does have an impact. Sometimes sooner, sometimes later. But this is one case where we can really see in a relatively short period of time, we have shamed our government. And so we have to keep pushing this a lot further. And that means we have to be doing the local work to stop the drones here at home. And we have to be doing international work. And that's why we're having a drone summit in November 16th and 17th in Washington, D.C. It will be the second one where we're bringing people together from the countries affected and bringing people together from Europe who want to stop the drone proliferation in their communities, bringing international legal experts, bringing together people from the cultural community that have been doing such wonderful work in song, in music, in graphics, in graffiti, in all kinds of manifestations of art, to get people to become more aware of what drones are all about. And we invite you all to join us. If you've signed up on that sign-up sheet, we have your names and we'll tell you more. Cornel West is going to come and start us out on the day of the summit. And we're very excited about the lineup of speakers that we have. But we also aren't people that just sit around and talk. So you can be assured that we're going to have some actions as part of that. And the whole purpose of the thing is to build a global network against drones. And a couple of months after that, a group in Berlin is going to have the next summit and invite people from all over Europe so that we can put pressure together on our own governments. And I think it's the grannies that are going to be working around the UN when the UN convenes in September. So we should talk about that because it's really important that we put pressure on the United Nations. The UN should be doing something to force the United States to comply with international law. There is a study that the UN is engaged in right now to see if the US has committed war crimes with these drones. We know that the US has committed war crimes, but if indeed this study proves it, this will be an extra push that we can do to force our government to change its policies. So I want to thank you all for the work you're doing. I want to encourage you to keep this work going because I think that we can ground the drones. I think that we can push as part of this policy to lower the military footprint that the United States has in the world. I think we can push to show people around the world that we want to relate with them as citizen to citizen, as friend to friend, as compassionate people. And I think if we do our work effectively enough, we will force that kind of change in our government's policy. So thank you very much. Power to the peaceful. Let's get out there and do it.
Thank you, Medea.